Chapter 1. Doomed Return. When the shockwave echoed through the mountains, the blinding light and deafening roar caught Michael Williams off guard. Debris, metal shards, and dust were thrown into the air. Michael lay on the ground, pinned down by the weight of his parachute, which he hadn't yet managed to remove. Just 5 minutes ago, he had thought he was finally saved. The evacuation operation, the long-awaited helicopter visible on the horizon, all of it had instantly turned into a nightmare. He looked around, struggling to catch his breath. All that was left of the helicopter was a burning heap of metal. The people he had considered his rescuers had become silent silhouettes among the wreckage. The air was thick with the stench of burning fuel, molten metal, and the sharp tang of blood. It all felt surreal to him, as if he were observing this nightmare from a distance. His ears were still ringing, but through the numbing sound, Michael heard muffled footsteps approaching him. His heart began to race. Could the rescuers have returned? He gathered all his strength to stand, but what he saw made him freeze in place. Out of the flaming debris emerged a tall man in black uniform, without any identifying marks. The stranger's face was hidden by a hood, but Michael recognized the familiar silver bracelet with a small scar on the wrist. Michael had seen this bracelet many years ago, on the wrist of a man who had been like a brother to him. "Aiden?" he gasped, feeling a cold chill run through his body. He had never expected to see him here, on the battlefield, among his rescuers, especially not among his enemies. The stranger stopped, then slowly pulled back his hood. Michael found himself staring into the cold, almost unfamiliar face of Aiden Sutton, his former comrade in arms, who, according to official reports, had died in combat 2 years ago. Yet here he was, standing before Michael, alive and well, though his eyes were deader than anybody on the field. "You were wrong, Michael," Aiden said, his voice echoing icily in the stillness. "I was never your friend, and this nightmare is just beginning." Before Michael could respond, a sharp blow to his head plunged him into darkness. His consciousness faded, and the last thing he heard was the hum of helicopters dissolving into the night. When he came to, the only thing he could see were the cold concrete walls of a cell and the dim light of a lamp that only deepened his despair. Michael realized that his return home had been nothing but an illusion. In reality, he was trapped in a new prison, this time set by someone he believed dead, but who had turned out to be far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Chapter 2. Memories of a peaceful life. Michael awoke in a cramped cell that seemed to absorb all warmth and light. His head throbbed with pain, and his body barely responded to his will. Directly above him, like a grim sentinel, hung a bare light bulb, casting a faint glow on the damp concrete walls. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in the back of his head forced a groan from his lips. In his mind, Aiden's voice still echoed, "You were wrong, Michael." What had happened? How could Aiden be alive? And why had he become an enemy? These questions swirled through his mind, but there were no answers. Instead, images from the past began to flash before his eyes. Times when life seemed simple and serene. The year was 2003, Washington, D.C. It was a warm spring day. In a park surrounded by tall trees, Michael Williams, then a young lieutenant, was strolling along the paths after a training session. A chance encounter at a coffee stand changed his life forever. Laura Randolph, a law student at Georgetown, caught his attention with her awkward attempt to balance 2 cups of coffee and her bag at the same time. Naturally, one of the cups tipped over, spilling coffee onto the ground. Michael, who had been watching with a slight smile, immediately approached her and offered his help. Laura, embarrassed, accepted his offer, and they returned to the stand together, where Michael insisted on buying her a new coffee. As they waited in line, a conversation sparked between them. during which Laura talked about her dream of becoming a successful lawyer, while Michael shared about his service in the Air Force and an upcoming promotion. Even then, her bright blue eyes reflected the determination and ambition that Michael later realized had made her so successful in her career. But at that moment, he was captivated by her easy laughter and the warmth she exuded. They exchanged phone numbers, marking the first step on a path that would soon lead to their shared life. These memories filled his mind, momentarily drowning out the growing sense of anxiety. But he couldn't linger in the past for long. Michael forced himself to push aside thoughts of happier days and focus on the present. He knew he had to find a way out of this cell, confront Aiden, and return home to Laura and Emma. But suddenly, more recent images came to the forefront of his mind. The last time he had seen Laura, she had looked tired, distant. Her eyes, which once sparkled with life, had grown dull. They were no longer the eyes he had once fallen in love with. Even then, he had sensed an invisible wall growing between them, but he couldn't understand why. The year was 2012, a small house in the suburbs of Washington. Laura, dressed in a sharp business suit, was preparing for an important meeting. Michael stood by the door, watching as she nervously adjusted her hair and tried to hide the signs of exhaustion under her eyes. She avoided his gaze, and it made him feel like she was slipping further away from him. Their conversations had become rare, and her responses monosyllabic. She almost never talked about her work, and he didn't ask, too absorbed in his missions. Back then, he hadn't paid much attention to this distance, attributing it to stress and work. But now, lying on the cold floor of the cell, he realized her behavior had been a signal that he had ignored. Something had gone wrong even then. He should have understood it earlier, but war and duty had completely consumed his focus. Returning to harsh reality, Michael took a deep breath. His captivity wouldn't last long if he acted. He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. He needed to escape, but first, he had to understand why Aiden had betrayed him and how he was connected to Laura. He could no longer afford to remain in the dark. The determination to return home and get answers gave him strength. In this fight for survival and truth, he would not make any more mistakes. Whatever it took, Michael was ready to confront his past face to face and find out what had led him into this trap. Chapter 3: Separation and First Doubts. Michael had been sitting on the cold floor of the cell for hours, maybe even days. Time had lost its meaning in this dark, grim place where every hour stretched into an eternity. The only sound that broke the silence was the muted dripping of water from a cracked pipe in the corner. But his thoughts weren't occupied with the bleak reality around him. Instead, they were filled with memories that had suddenly taken on a new, troubling significance. He couldn't stop thinking about his last conversation with Laura before his final mission. At the time, he hadn't paid much attention to her words. But now, as he recalled them, a dark feeling crept into his soul, a sense that he had missed something important. The year was 2013, a military base in California. Michael was finishing his preparations for another mission when Laura flew out to visit him. She looked as elegant as ever, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. They sat in a small cafe near the base. Michael told her about his mission plans, trying not to delve into details. Laura listened, but her attention kept drifting away. "Mike, we need to talk," she began, nervously fidgeting with a napkin in her hands. There was a note of tension in her voice that he hadn't noticed at the time. "Have you ever thought about leaving all this, coming home and just being a family?" Michael smiled and reached out to take her hand. "Laura, you know this is my job. I made a promise to protect our country. It's not just a job for me. It's a duty. She squeezed his hand, but didn't look up. I understand. But sometimes I feel like you're not really here. You're always somewhere far away, on your missions, even when you're home. He remembered how he had promised her then that this mission would be his last, that he would come back, and they would finally spend time together as a real family. But he could see that her eyes didn't light up with joy as they used to. Laura just nodded, but her silence spoke louder than any words. These memories tormented him as he sat in the cell. He began to realize that her plea back then had been a final, desperate cry for help that he had ignored, and it led to the unraveling of their connection. He blamed himself for being so consumed by his duty that he hadn't noticed how Laura had started to drift away. However, when he thought of Aiden's face, his inner voice told him that it wasn't just about him and Laura. There was something more, something beyond his understanding. Aiden's betrayal ran deeper than personal motives, and Michael began to suspect that Laura might have been involved in some way. But how? What could have driven her to cross a line they had never discussed? He recalled their last meeting. She hadn't mentioned anything specific, but her tone, her manner of speaking, flashes of memories intertwined with cold reality. Perhaps Laura knew something related to his capture, or worse, had she become a pawn in the hands of those who wanted him destroyed? Suddenly, the silence of the cell was broken by the sound of a lock turning. The heavy metal door swung open with a clang, and the silhouette of a man appeared in the doorway. Light hit Michael's eyes, making him squint. When his vision cleared, he saw a guard in a black uniform, armed to the teeth. "Get up, Captain Williams," the guard said with a mocking smirk. "You're expected." Michael tried to stand, but his legs buckled from weakness. The guard roughly grabbed him by the arm and dragged him down the corridor. The dim lights above barely illuminated their path until they reached a steel door, behind which, judging by the sounds, more people awaited. The door swung open, and Michael was led into a spacious room with dim lighting. At the table sat a man he had never seen before. He was middle-aged, with a cold and calculating expression. Papers were spread out in front of him, and on one of the documents was a signature. Laura's signature. "Sit down, Captain," the man said without looking up from the papers. "We need to discuss your future, and believe me, it's not as bright as you might think." A wave of anger and fear washed over Michael. Now he knew one thing for sure. His capture was no accident. It was part of a more complex game, in which Laura might play a far more significant role. Only now did he realize just how deep the betrayal could go, and how difficult it would be to return home, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Chapter 4. Escape or trap. Michael struggled to sit in the chair, feeling as though his veins were filled with cold lead. The man across from him looked up, his gray eyes impassively scanning Michael's face as if he were just another faceless victim. "I must say, Captain, you've made quite a name for yourself during your career," the man began, flipping through some papers. "But now your story is coming to an end." Michael gritted his teeth, but remained silent. He knew he couldn't give these people any information to think about. It was better to listen and understand what he was dealing with than act. In this game, every word could be a fatal mistake. The man tossed the papers onto the table and then pulled a small object from his jacket pocket, placing it in front of Michael. It was an old silver coin, deeply scratched on the surface. Michael recognized it instantly. Laura had inherited this coin from her grandfather. He had given it to her on their wedding day as a symbol of eternal love and loyalty. She had always carried it with her, and now it lay before him as a grim reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. "Surprised?" the man asked, noticing how Michael's gaze lingered on the coin. "I imagine you're curious about how it ended up here." "I am too, to be honest. But when your old friend Aiden handed it to me, I began to realize that this game is much more complex than I thought. Michael listened in silence, but panic was building inside him. Laura knew what this coin meant to him, and if it had fallen into the hands of an enemy, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, a sign that someone was using her against him. But how and why? We both know, Captain, that your days are numbered. Returning home was never part of our plans, the man continued. But circumstances have changed. Aiden made us an offer we couldn't refuse. Aiden? Michael managed to say, struggling to stay calm. What does he want? He wants you to suffer, Captain. And as you can see, he has all the tools necessary to make that happen. The man smirked, and Michael felt his blood start to boil. He knows you're going to die anyway, but he wants it to happen on his terms. Michael realized the situation was critical. If Aiden had truly betrayed him and was manipulating Laura, he had little time to think. He needed to find a way to escape while he still had the strength. All of this is part of his game, isn't it? Michael asked, trying to distract the man with the conversation. But what did he offer you in return? Why are you listening to him? The man leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table. He offered us you, and believe me, that's a high price. Michael felt a cold chill run down his spine. He understood that his life had long since become a commodity to be sold or traded. But at that moment, a plan began to form in his mind. He suddenly stood up, knocking over the chair, and lunged for the door. The man didn't even have time to react before Michael delivered a sharp blow to his face, grabbed the coin from the table, and bolted into the corridor. Alarms blared, warning the guards. But Michael didn't stop. He raced down the hallways, grabbing onto the walls as he barely managed to round the corners. He knew time was short. The guards would surround him any moment. He saw a light ahead and sprinted toward it, understanding that it was his only chance for freedom. Once outside, he spotted a jeep parked by the gate. In a few swift movements, he was at the vehicle, smashed the window, and climbed inside. Finding the ignition wires, he hotwired the car, and the engine roared to life. The jeep sped off, but Michael knew the pursuers wouldn't give up. He raced down the rough road, weaving through the narrow streets of a small town. It was easy to guess he was somewhere in the Middle East, but he didn't know his exact location. The only thing he knew for sure was that he had to escape this nightmare and find Laura before it was too late. Fragments of his conversation with the man still echoed in his mind. Michael didn't know how much of it was true, but he knew one thing. Aiden was alive and playing by his own rules. And now he wouldn't stop at anything to destroy everything Michael had ever loved. As Michael reached the outskirts of the town and drove onto a deserted highway, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. Mountains loomed ahead, perhaps a chance for salvation. But now he knew the real battle was just beginning. A battle for his life, his family, and the truth he had been reluctant to face for so long. Chapter 5. Revelation of the Truth. The highway stretched ahead like an endless black ribbon, dissolving into the night's darkness. Michael sped along in the jeep, not slowing down. Feeling his pulse pounding in his temples, his thoughts were consumed by one thing. Laura. What did she know? How could she be involved in this conspiracy? And why had Aiden, a man he once trusted, become his greatest enemy? Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, he noticed headlights. The pursuers were catching up. Michael gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to panic. He veered off the highway onto a narrow mountain road that led upwards. This path was dangerous, but he knew he had no other choice. The road became steeper and more winding. The jeep growled as it tackled each turn, but the headlights behind him stayed close. Michael knew they would catch him sooner or later, if he didn't find a way to throw them off. Ahead, around the next bend, he spotted a narrow bridge spanning a deep ravine. Michael accelerated, intending to cross it first and then destroy the bridge to block the pursuers. As the jeep shot onto the bridge, it slowed for a moment. Then Michael sharply turned the wheel to the right and slammed on the brakes. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and Michael jumped out, grabbing a weapon and a canister of gasoline he found in the trunk. He quickly poured the gasoline onto the wooden beams of the bridge, then set them alight, watching as the flames hungrily consumed the wood. The headlights approached, and Michael barely managed to cross to the other side before the fire blazed to the point where the road became impassable. The first pursuing vehicle screeched to a halt, but it was too late. The bridge collapsed with a crash, and the car, along with it, plummeted into the ravine, leaving behind only sparks and a dull thud as it hit the ground. Michael didn't linger to watch the outcome. He knew his time was running out. Descending the mountainside, he made his way along a barely visible path leading to a small village he had spotted from afar. Now he needed to find shelter where he could catch his breath and plan his next steps. The village was poor and abandoned. Small adobe houses stood silent, as if deserted by their inhabitants. Only a light in one of the windows indicated that someone still lived there. Michael approached, hoping to find refuge and perhaps food or water. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open slightly. An elderly woman appeared, her face lined with wrinkles, her eyes weary from life. She didn't speak English, but Michael could tell from his exhausted and worn appearance that she was willing to help. Inside, the house was cramped but warm. The woman offered him a cup of tea and pointed to an old mattress in the corner of the room where he could lie down. Michael didn't refuse, feeling a wave of fatigue wash over him. He sat down, trying to organize his thoughts. Later that night, when the house had fallen silent, Michael took the coin Laura had given him out of his pocket, the same one the man in the cell had left on the table. He turned it over in his hands, trying to decipher its significance. The coin was the only link connecting him to Laura and possibly revealing her role in this conspiracy. He recalled how she had spoken of her grandfather, who had left her this coin. It was a symbol of their family's history, their love, and Laura had always carried it with her. If the coin had ended up in the hands of his enemies, it meant Laura was in danger. But how could she have allowed something so precious to fall into their hands? Michael began to recall the months leading up to his last mission. Laura had been spending more time at work. Her phone calls had grown shorter, and their meetings had become rare. He had blamed her hectic schedule and career ambitions, but now it all looked different. Perhaps she had been hiding something more, something that connected her to Aiden and those who were now hunting him. His thoughts returned to Aiden. Why had he, a man Michael once considered a friend, become his enemy? What had driven him to betrayal? The answer likely lay in the past, in something they had both experienced during their service. But to find the answers, Michael needed to return to the roots, to the place where it all began. In the morning, before sunrise, Michael bid farewell to the elderly woman and set off back toward the mountain range. He knew the journey would be long and dangerous, but he had no other choice. He had to return to the United States, find Laura, and discover what had happened. In this game of survival, there was no room for mistakes. When he reached the top of the hill, where the trail to the next town began, he paused for a moment to look back. Ahead lay an endless desert, and behind him, the dark mountains from which he had just escaped. Michael clenched his fist, tightly holding the coin. He knew even greater challenges awaited him, but he was ready for anything. Now, his goal was clear. Return home, find Laura, and uncover the truth. But on this path, he would have to go through hell, and he was prepared for it. Chapter 6, The Revelation. Michael walked along the desert path, heading toward the nearest town, where he hoped to find transportation and a way to contact the outside world. His mind was swirling with thoughts, each more troubling than the last. He tried to piece together all the details that were slipping through his fingers like sand. Why Laura? Why Aiden? How had they become entangled in this deadly conspiracy? He knew the answers were close, and he was determined to find them. After several hours of exhausting travel, Michael reached a small village on the edge of the desert. He stumbled upon a local market where vendors offered their goods under makeshift awnings, sheltering from the scorching sun. Michael, exhausted and dirty, attracted curious glances, but no one dared approach him. His sole objective was to find a phone and contact someone who could help him return home. Finally, he found a small cafe with an old phone booth. Michael staggered inside and quickly dialed a number he knew by heart. After several long rings, a familiar voice answered on the other end. Captain Roberts, his old comrade in arms, whom he trusted more than anyone else. "Roberts, it's Williams," Michael rasped, feeling the tension leave his body at the sound of his old friend's voice. "I need help. I'm in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the Middle East. It's a long story, but I need to get out of here and back to the US urgently." Roberts was silent for a few seconds before replying. "Michael, you're damn lucky to be alive. We thought you died in that operation. How did you manage to escape?" "It's a long story, Roberts, but listen, this is important. Aiden Sutton, he's alive, and he's involved in some kind of conspiracy. I need to get back and figure out what's going on. I think Laura is somehow connected to this, but I don't have proof. I need you to help me get home and cover my back while I sort this out." Roberts sighed, and his voice took on a note of concern. "Michael, I'll take care of it. We have the resources to get you out of there. But be careful. If Aiden is really involved, we're dealing with something serious. I'll send a team for your extraction, but stay out of trouble until they arrive." Michael thanked Roberts and hung up. He knew things were now moving in the right direction, but ahead lay even more questions than answers. All that remained was to wait for the extraction and return home. A few hours later, a special forces team sent by Roberts picked Michael up. They evacuated him to the nearest Allied military base, where he received initial medical treatment. The next day, he was flown back to the US on a military transport plane. Michael ended up at a secret base where he met with Roberts. There, he learned for the first time that Aiden was not only alive, but actively working against him. Roberts laid out documents and photographs that linked Aiden to a private military company closely associated with the firm where Laura worked. Aiden used Laura to pass information and cover his tracks, Roberts said, his voice full of concern. He manipulated her, making her believe it was for your safety. Michael felt a tight knot form inside him. "Are you saying Laura knew about this?" "She may not have known everything, but she was definitely involved," Roberts replied cautiously. "We tracked her contacts with Aiden over the past few months. It doesn't look like a coincidence." This information was the last straw for Michael. He realized he needed to return home and find out the truth himself. Michael arrived at their home late in the evening, avoiding prying eyes. His heart sank when he saw that the house was just as he had left it before his last mission. But something had changed. The twilight in the room where they used to have family dinners now felt cold and unfamiliar. He entered the house, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. He noticed that Laura was in their bedroom, with light seeping through the partially opened door. He slowly approached, but before opening the door, he stopped, trying to calm the emotions that were overwhelming him. Michael quietly entered the room and found Laura in a partially dressed state. She was standing by the bed, her back to the door, when she heard Michael enter. She turned around sharply, her face paling with shock. But that wasn't the only thing that stunned Michael. On the bed, Hurriedly covering himself with a sheet was Aiden. "Michael," Laura's voice trembled. "It's not what you think. Not what I think." Michael stood rooted to the spot, his eyes blazing with rage. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, but the facts spoke for themselves. Aiden rose from the bed, keeping his hands visible. "Calm down, Michael. Let's talk." "Talk?" Michael's voice broke into a rasp. "You slept with my wife while I was in hell, and you want to talk?" Laura began to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't know what to do. You were gone, and I was alone. Aiden was there. He said you were in danger, that only he could help." Michael felt the anger surge through him. He stepped forward, grabbing Aiden by the throat and pinning him against the wall. "You used her. You planned all of this to destroy me, didn't you?" Aiden struggled to breathe, but there was no fear in his eyes, only icy calm. "Yes, Michael, I used her, because you took what I considered mine. Now I've taken yours." Michael released him and stepped back, feeling his strength leave him. Laura had remained silent the entire time, her face pale and wet with tears. "Michael," she whispered, reaching out, but he pulled away, not letting her touch him. "Don't," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "You made your choice. Now live with it." Michael turned and left the room without looking back. His head was ringing, and he felt his life falling apart. All he wanted was to get out of there, away from Laura, from Aiden, from this entire nightmare. Outside, he paused for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. His mind was in chaos, but one thing was clear. He could no longer trust anyone. Now he was alone, and ahead of him lay a new war, a war against those who had betrayed him, against his own demons, and against a past that would never be the same. Again, Chapter 7. The final battle. The night's chill bit into his skin, but Michael barely felt it. He stood on the doorstep of the house that had once been his sanctuary, staring up at the bleak sky. Everything he knew and believed in was crumbling. Laura, his wife, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Aiden, his former friend, had become his enemy. Now he had nothing left but the desire for revenge and to protect the little that still mattered: his life and the future of their daughter, Emma. Michael didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't hesitate. Aiden was dangerous, and his plans were far from over. Michael knew Aiden wouldn't stop until he was completely destroyed. But now, Michael had a purpose: to survive and fight back. He headed toward his car, parked a few blocks from the house. Inside him, rage boiled, giving him strength. Michael knew he needed time to think everything through and prepare for the next step. But first, he had to find out where Aiden was hiding and what he was planning. Michael recalled Roberts' words about the private military company connected to Aiden. This company was the key to understanding everything that had happened. It could be the headquarters where the plans for his elimination were being developed. Perhaps there, he would find the answers to all his questions. Michael contacted Roberts once he reached a safe location. They agreed to meet at an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where no one would look for them. Roberts was already there when Michael walked inside. "Michael, I'm glad you got out of that mess," Roberts said, shaking his hand. "But you look like you've seen a ghost." "I've seen something worse," Michael replied grimly. "Laura was with Aiden. They were cheating on me, and she knew everything." Roberts nodded silently, his face turning serious. "That's heavy. But what's more important now is figuring out what they're planning. We have leads that point to their base. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Michael clenched his fists. "I have no choice. I have to end this once and for all." Roberts unfolded a map, marking a location, a building belonging to the private military company, where, according to their intel, Aiden was hiding. It was a heavily guarded facility on the outskirts of the city, disguised as an ordinary office. Roberts provided Michael with information on the building's layout and possible entry points. "We need to strike fast and precise," Roberts said. "You have only one shot. We'll create a diversion outside, and you'll infiltrate the building and find Aiden. But remember, he won't go down without a fight." Michael nodded. He was ready for this to be his final mission. But if it meant the end of Aiden, he was prepared for anything. The night was dark and moonless when Michael and his team approached the building. They quickly took their positions, preparing for the assault. Roberts gave the signal, and several soldiers began the diversion at the main entrance. An explosion shattered the silence, and Michael seized the moment to slip inside through a side door. Inside, it was dark, with only a few lamps lighting the long corridors. Michael moved cautiously, trying not to make a sound. He knew Aiden could be anywhere and was prepared for surprises. When he reached the central hall, an eerie silence surrounded him. Suddenly, a voice sounded from behind him. "I knew you would come, Michael." Michael turned sharply and saw Aiden standing in the middle of the hall. He looked calm, as if he had been expecting him all along. In Aiden's hand was a pistol aimed directly at Michael. "You betrayed me, Aiden," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside he was boiling with anger. "You took everything from me," Aiden smirked. "You gave it all to me yourself. You were so consumed by your war that you forgot what really mattered. You left Laura, and she found comfort with me. You were too blind to see it. I was blind, but now I see," Michael replied, slowly raising his weapon. "And I won't let you get away with it. You'll have to kill me if you want that," Aiden said calmly, pulling the trigger. But there was no shot. The gun jammed, and in that instant, Michael lunged forward. A fierce struggle ensued between them. They exchanged blows, each filled with the pain and hatred that had built up over the years. Aiden was strong and experienced, but Michael moved with the desperate determination of a man with nothing left to lose. At one point, they both reached for the gun, which flew from Aiden's hand and fell to the floor. Michael got to it first and aimed the weapon at his former friend. "This is the end, Aiden," he said, breathing heavily, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Maybe," Aiden replied with a smirk. "But even if you kill me, it won't bring Laura back. She's already made her choice." Michael gritted his teeth. He knew Aiden was right. Even victory in this battle wouldn't bring him peace. But he couldn't let Aiden go. At that moment, he heard shouts and gunfire outside. It was Roberts' team fighting the remaining guards. Michael had only seconds to make his decision. "You've lost, Aiden," Michael said, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed, shattering the silence. Aiden staggered, his eyes widening in shock, and he collapsed to the floor. Michael stood over him, watching as life drained from his body. When it was over, Michael felt empty. He had done what he had to do, but it brought no relief. Aiden was dead, but the pain remained. Michael exited the building, where Roberts was waiting for him. He looked at his old friend and nodded. It was all over. But the feeling of victory never came. Inside, there was only emptiness. "What now?" Roberts asked, looking at Michael. "Now I start over," Michael replied, gazing up at the dark sky. "But first, I need to deal with the past." He knew there was still much pain and trials ahead, but now he was free from his demons. He was ready to move forward, no matter how difficult the road might be. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. Several days had passed since Michael finally ended things with Aiden. Time seemed to have stopped for him. He returned to the base, where Roberts was waiting for him. There, he underwent a medical examination and several debriefings, protocol that always followed missions like this. But all of it felt like empty formalities. Michael knew that the real battles lay ahead, the ones he would have to fight within himself. Michael sat in his temporary room, staring out the window at the military base, where life went on as usual. Soldiers trained, helicopters took off and landed, and somewhere in the distance, military music played. It all seemed foreign and distant to him, as if he were watching it from another world. His mind kept drifting back to Laura, to their home, to that night when he discovered the truth that had forever changed his life. Roberts entered the room without knocking, interrupting his thoughts. He brought a folder of documents and sat down across from Michael. "It's all official," Roberts said, handing over the folder. "Aiden is dead. The operation is complete. You can go back to a normal life now." Michael nodded, but didn't take the documents. "A normal life," he quietly repeated. "But what kind of life do I have now?" Roberts sighed and placed the folder on the table. "You know, Michael, I've seen people come out of worse situations. It won't be easy, but you have a chance to start over." Michael remained silent, trying to make sense of these words. He knew Roberts was right. He had a chance to start with a clean slate, but he didn't know where to begin. His home was destroyed, his marriage betrayed, and the future was uncertain. "Have you spoken to Laura?" Roberts finally asked. Michael shook his head. "No, I don't know if I can." Roberts sighed again. "You need to do it, Michael. You need to close this chapter, no matter what she did. You both deserve an honest conversation." Michael understood that Roberts was right. He couldn't move on without confronting the past. He had to face Laura and try to find answers to his questions. No matter what he might hear, it was something he owed to himself. When Michael finally returned to the house, everything was quiet. Laura's belongings were gone, as was she. It wasn't a surprise. Michael knew she wouldn't stay after what had happened. The house felt empty and cold, like a place that had once been full of life, but was now abandoned. He walked through the empty rooms, touching familiar objects. The paintings on the walls, the photographs, the furniture. All of it was part of his former life, which now felt alien. He stopped by the family photo on the mantel, where Laura and Emma were smiling, hugging him. At that moment, everything had seemed perfect. But now, it was just a memory that could never be reclaimed. Suddenly, Michael heard the sound of a car pulling up. He walked to the window and saw Laura. She got out of the car, her face full of anxiety. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting. Michael opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. They stood facing each other in silence, the stillness between them overwhelming. Finally, Laura spoke first. "Michael, I came to explain," she said, her voice trembling. But she tried to hold herself together. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." Michael looked at her, feeling anger and pain intertwine in his chest. "You betrayed me, Laura. You chose him. You let him destroy our life." Laura covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back tears. "I was weak, Michael. I let fear and loneliness control me. Aiden took advantage of that. I know I can't fix anything now, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry for everything." Michael remained silent, his heart torn between pain and the desire to forgive. But he knew that some wounds never heal. "That doesn't change what happened," he finally said. "But I forgive you, Laura. Not for us, but for myself. I need to move on, and to do that, I have to let go of the past." Laura sobbed and nodded. "Thank you, Michael. I wish you all the best." They stood in silence for a few more seconds before Laura turned and walked back to her car. She drove away, leaving Michael alone on the porch. But this time, he didn't feel emptiness. He felt relief. He had let go of the past and was ready for a new beginning. A few months later, Michael sold the house and moved to another city. He started a new job, one that wasn't connected to military service. He found a way to rebuild his life, step by step. Emma stayed with him, and that was the only thing that gave him the strength to carry on. Michael learned to live with the pain, not allowing it to destroy him. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. Now he understood that the real battle is always fought within, and he was ready for it. This new life wasn't perfect, but it was his, and that was enough.